Good afternoon and welcome to Communitech Chat. I'm here today with Dr. William Ciccotelli, who's the Medical Director for Infection Prevention and Control at St. Mary's and Grand River Hospitals here in Waterloo Region. As such, Bill has been at the forefront of our local response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'd like to thank you, Bill, for generously taking time out of what must be a crazy schedule to talk with us today. Welcome.
Oh, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
So, Bill, as we're now more than 2 months into this pandemic in Waterloo Region, there's so much we could talk about, but I think what it would be most helpful if we could use this time today to reinforce the facts and dispel maybe some of the myths around COVID-19. This is especially important as we are now starting to talk about easing the lockdown, reopening the economy, and returning to workplaces. So if you don't mind, we're just going to jump right in and ask some questions.
Sure.
First, let's start off with, what do we know about how coronavirus spreads? What actually needs to happen for someone to become infected with COVID-19?
So, like a lot of respiratory viruses, this is, something that starts to replicate in, one's nasal passage, one's throat, one's lungs, and makes many copies of the virus. And so, as that virus starts to replicate, it can then become transmissible as symptoms start. And we predominantly think of this virus as spreading through what we call droplets, which are large molecules of respiratory secretions that have the virus, but potentially also secondarily through contaminated surfaces. And although we don't really quite know as much as we think about COVID-19 so far as what the relative value of those two mechanisms are, we do really recognize that it is predominantly spread through respiratory secretions, and we use a lot of our knowledge of other coronaviruses to make that assumption on. So when you are sick, you're more likely to spread it when you're coughing or sneezing or taking those droplets that are filled with virus and spreading them to your environment or to people that you're in close association with. And so what does it take for someone to become infected? Well, a lot of it is, are you meeting somebody at the right time in their illness? Are you receiving a high enough dose of those viruses to very key parts of your body, such as your mouth, your nose, your eyes? Are you doing so in a very unprotected way, i.e. no barrier, no social distancing, no separation between you and the other person? And really, are you having a critical duration or type of exposure in which it's very intense or very prolonged? And so these are some of the variables that we talk about in terms of how that symptomatic patient can spread it to somebody that they come in contact with within a household or a community. Everything that we're talking about COVID-19 is exactly what we should be doing every respiratory year. Not going to work if you're sick, respiratory etiquette if you're coughing and sneezing, staying away from people that are sick, washing your hands frequently, right? And the only things that have made us comfortable is that we all have immunity to these common respiratory viruses. We all kind of tolerate it, right? But, every year people die of influenza, people die of RSV, right? Every year kids incubated and amplified in schools and then bring it home to the family unit that brings it to the grandparents or into the long-term care. So these are things that we've seen quite yearly with flu. With influenza, you can transmit before you get symptoms. You can transmit with symptoms. This is not different. I think the only thing that changes with COVID is none of us have immunity, so we may get more severe forms because of that. And the issue about the windows of when the virus starts and stops is definitely longer than influenza. But it is, all of these things that you're talking about is what we should be doing every year. We've just gotten lax, or because we have vaccines, because we have treatment, because it's not, affecting the middle of society and not at either age range, there's a different perception about it.
So, I recently saw a young man out running this morning, and he was wearing a mask. And I've also noticed more and more people wearing masks out in public, at the grocery store, etc. How exactly do masks help prevent the spread of the virus, and what are some of the misconceptions about them? And should we all be wearing masks all the time, or should that young man who's running down the street this morning need to wear a mask if he's, 30 feet from anyone?
Well, I think the biggest thing that we're finding out with how we're viewing masks is they're very much a way of barriering our ability to transmit. They're forming an initial safety check in that if you are symptomatic and you're spreading, but you need to go somewhere, say to a medical setting, or if you are asymptomatic and you don't know that you're able to spread, it is a barrier to transmission. It's kind of a universal preventative measure that allows people to come within close contact and reduce the efficiency of any transmission. And on the other side, the person who's wearing the mask who isn't potentially able to spread, it's forming a minor barrier or maybe incomplete protection to that individual that in case there's a breach or a break in what's happening. So for most of what we're seeing with the mask use, it's to deal with at times when you can't anticipate keeping your social distance, or in situations where you really want to have more of a face-to-face conversation where there's no other option. It helps protect both parties to different degrees. And again, it is meant to try to interrupt transmission before you know that you may have the virus. So should we all be wearing a mask? I think as we're moving forward and we're trying to have this great conversation about, reopening the economy, trying to resume activities as normal as one can, this is how we're going to have the longevity of those abilities, right? This is one leg in an arsenal of preventative steps that we can do that allow us all to minimize person-to-person transmission, especially when you can't maintain social distance. If you're alone out in public, out in the great outdoors, and nobody's around you, you don't really need to wear a mask. There's not, this isn't an airborne spread virus. So if you have a clear line of sight and you're not anticipating, having a close conversation with somebody or not being able to maintain your 2 meters, wearing a mask in the wide open is probably unnecessary, but I think a lot of it is personal preference about what makes them feel safe to go back out in public as well.
You used some terminology there. Perhaps you could share with us what the meaning of asymptomatic, pre-symptomatic. Just give us an understanding.
Well, you know what? That's a great question, Ian, because these terms are thrown around in popular media quite often, maybe without a good explanation. So when we talk about something who is asymptomatic, it is somebody who might have evidence of viral detection. So the lab test can find the virus in the airways, but they don't have any clinical signs and symptoms of being sick. And where this kind of diverges is a group of these people will go on to develop symptoms very shortly thereafter. And they're probably best termed to be pre-symptomatic people. People that are ramping up their infection, they don't have symptoms, but they're about to become symptomatic, versus a smaller minority who are truly remain free of symptoms that they can perceive. But you really don't know them until they've had about 14 days with the virus to truly know that they've cleared their incubation period. And so this does serve as a lot of kind of difficulty interpreting popular news stories when they speak to how many people are asymptomatic and what that might mean. Whereas when you follow a lot of them, the vast majority do eventually go on to develop symptoms. And over time, we've learned that there is a wide spread of symptoms that could be related back to COVID-19, which further kind of shows that number shrinks more and more and more. How is it relevant? I think the biggest thing is if you don't know that you're sick, there's no signs for people around you to avoid you. So like one of the things that we talk about in infection prevention control is avoiding being around sick people. Well, it's hard to have that cue if somebody's not sneezing or coughing or looking awful, like they are in fact sick with a respiratory virus. But it also, is a situation where you don't know then yourself to take precautions, right? If you're lax with your social distancing, or if you're lax with sharing items with household members, or you're lax with your mask, that's where the small window of opportunity is created.
Mm-hmm. And we've heard reports that that seem to be saying that potentially a high number of people who are infected are asymptomatic.
Well, everybody will start asymptomatic. I'm not sure that we truly understand the total portion that will stay asymptomatic.
Right.
As I said, if you look at some very popular outbreaks where they watch people roll through the outbreak, the number of asymptomatics slowly gets replaced as they develop symptoms. So best estimates look somewhere between 1% and 15%, but I think overall, like a lot of things in COVID, we just don't have good corners on that number yet. But again, it goes back to the masking and some of these universal strategies that we're using to try to take away the uncertainty about who may be asymptomatic and inefficiently able to spread the virus by just saying we're going to stop all transmission possibilities as much as we can, as often as we can.
Yeah. And I think it speaks to, there's a couple of things in here, one of which is, of course, I guess everyone's asymptomatic until they actually start exhibiting the symptoms. But challenge, of course, is that a lot of the screening measures we're putting in place right now are things like temperature and other obvious symptoms. And so people are contagious, they are infected, but we don't know it. And hence the need for things like masks and other types of ways that we can protect ourselves. Early on, and I think throughout all of this, there's been, talk about how potentially this is different for children. And at first it was they were more likely to be asymptomatic, but to be infected. And I'm wondering if there's any more clarity about how this might be affecting children differently than adults.
That's been a very interesting issue with this. Unlike influenza, which we really historically know affects both the very young and the very old in ways that lead to very significant clinical issues, children with COVID-19, at least when you look at the Ontario and Canadian data, really don't have a high case number rate, and it's not clear why. They certainly, when small numbers of them are studied at say like teaching centers or children's hospitals, they can get quite sick. And you see some of the same common themes that you do with adults, that they have underlying health issues or genetic issues or structural or abnormal lungs. But overall, they seem to be different than, say, the adult population. And I don't think we have a good explanation yet. So one argument might be that at the time that Ontario was starting to really increase the number of cases in the community, we were kind of around the March break time, and then schools shut down. And the thing that you see with children being amplifiers of the virus in the community never happened because they stopped commingling in an enclosed setting like you would see, at a typical school classroom. The other possibility there might be some biological protection, and there's some early research looking at the quantity of certain receptors in the airways that seem to increase as people age. And that might explain why kids seem to be more relative immune to the virus than, say, adults or seniors.
Right.
But again, it's something that is quite fascinating, and I don't think we have a clear explanation for yet.
Right.
But again, whether they're protected from it or not, as a parent myself, I would want to keep them safe, and I would want them not to be able to transmit it within a household, because obviously adults are clearly the largest group of people who are getting infected, and if those children also have grandparents, it's a way of not bringing the virus into a household setting or into a family cluster.
Mm-hmm. I guess the other question I've got is, how important, when we think about all of this, how important is testing going to be, and the capacity to be able to test at scale? And of course, we've heard a lot about contact tracing and tracking. Are those really the two things that we need to get really good at right now in order for us to go back to a little more normalcy in their lives?
Yeah, I think when it comes to, as we are coming down from the peak, I think we have this ability to kind of reset the strategy, right? Mm-hmm. We've tackled the first wave. The case numbers in the community are coming down. The outbreaks are stopping, or at least hopefully coming under control. what the testing is going to allow us to do is refocus on what you said, which is the contact tracing, which is we have the capacity that people who are sick can get tested quickly, and hopefully because there are few of them at the beginning, it makes it easier to bring the public health groups into the conversation to go make sure that all of the people they've been in contact with can get tested quickly as well, and to use that to help with isolation strategies, take people out of the public while they're potentially contagious, to reduce the number of possible new cases that spread from that initial case. You know, looking back at the provincial data, at some points in the province, one case was generating 7 new cases. And so we don't want to have individual cases able to amplify to that level that quickly. So contact tracing is certainly a way that we can reduce those windows. Testing will be paramount to making sure that we can go back to a very strong preventative health strategy and a public health intervention.
That would be nice, and certainly we've seen lately some real focus on, or at least steps taking us in the right direction of getting to the levels of testing that we need. I certainly know that you know, in our world, what we would love to be able to see is anyone who's an essential service worker have the capacity to be able to be tested, and that's thousands and thousands of tests. So hopefully we can get there sooner rather than later. The other question I got for you, Bill, is you know, there's people who are burning down 5G towers, and there's conspiracy theorists, but I mean, what's the craziest thing that Donald Trump has said from your perspective?
Oh my God! So, some of the stuff about injecting bleach and inserting lights goes without saying.
Doesn't work? Is that what you're saying, Bill?
No, it does not work. But I think just the general issue in which you know, the science is represented, or let me think about this one for a second, Ian, because there's so many jokes from Twitter that I've downloaded that just represent how I feel. But a lot of it, I think, is just, it's not one thing. I certainly had a chuckle and then was intensely frustrated about the Clorox solution. But I think it's just how disingenuous the science is being brought to the people in both America and obviously to some collateral effect into Canada, in which there's mixed messaging, there is an ignorance of what should be done at certain timelines. There's an inadvertent rush, and it really is leading to maybe in the U.S., at least as represented on popular media, a very lacking social contract amongst the population to all say, we can do this together, we can reopen our economy, we can go back to a normal life if we all just agree to pull on the rope together. And I think it's the accumulative effect of all of those negative messages that are creating potentially dangerous situations. Now, hopefully, and I think most Americans, I think, do get the message. You know, they trust the medical experts more than the politicians. They trust the state level governors more than the president. But I think it's that, you know, we're all in this together. We all have something to gain if we work together. The things that we're asking may be foreign, but they're not outrageous. There's more damage to the economy, and there's more damage to people's health and the ability for the healthcare system to assist everybody if they were unlucky enough to become unwell, if we keep ping-ponging back and forth. Right? I don't know what it's like in the business world, but in the healthcare world, that's obviously what we're trying to guard against, is losing the ability to deliver care when it's most needed. You know, are there going to maybe be more cases? Yes, but if they come in a lower stream or a lower volume, we can manage that. What we can't manage is what happened in New York. And so the disingenuous messaging of, you know, saying one thing on Twitter and contradicting the experts in press conferences has not been helpful.
So what about a vaccine? How far off are we? And what we should be keeping in mind about a vaccine in general? How much do we know about this virus, and will there be a vaccine?
I think we do realize that coronaviruses are slightly different than some of our other respiratory viruses. Even when you talk about the regular seasonal coronavirus, that immunity may not be as long lasting as we would want it to be. No, not that it doesn't mean that the next time you get the illness, you don't have a more mild, set of symptoms. Maybe you're not as sick as you were the first time. And it may reduce your efficiency of transmission because you have some immune response that maybe tamps down how much virus is being shed. So with the novel coronavirus, we see some of those, possibilities that, if we develop a vaccine, will it work? Will it interrupt transmission well enough? Or will it not be able to provide enough immunity? So the questions that circulate in my mind is, if we can find a safe and effective vaccine, and to me, I think this is 2021 we're talking, can we get enough of it into arms that if it has only a short duration of immunity, that we can get enough herd immunity in our population to make transmission inefficient?
Right.
Really, and then lots of questions that go beyond what I would understand, but how would that be rolled out? Which key groups would get it? Things where we want to think about strategically about essentially we're using the vaccine to either mitigate really severe illness in people that have never been exposed, or to deploy it to try to interrupt efficient transmission in the community. Similar to how we view flu vaccine. We do the same strategies with that. We ask everybody to be vaccinated so that everybody is less efficient to transmit. And the people that are at the in the critical health groups or at the different ends of the age spectrum, a lot of it comes into play to be to prevent them from getting severe disease. Right. So the big question with this vaccine is, how will it play into those two strategies? How good will it be? There's not been a lot of coronavirus vaccine research that I'm aware of, although they're going to probably anchor this off of some of the preliminary work that they did with SARS and MERS. But this is truly going to be an interesting scientific process and discovery. Having read a book about polio vaccine and talked to my parents and stuff, it's an interesting social time when they actually did finally come up with a vaccine that made everybody feel safe to go back to normal life. It'll be interesting to see how this is received amongst our population. What I really hope is that people take it up wisely, use it, not have resistance to being vaccinated, because it really will help us get back to true normality.
Right. Or we just take the people who don't want to take the vaccine, and we put them up on Manitoulin Island and take away their boats. I think there's going to be, I think there's going to be a different kind of social contract. I think there's going to be, I look at the way government is behaving right now, and how fast they're moving and their willingness to, Health Canada is, something that we used to take 6 to 12 months to get approved is now getting approved in 24 to 48 hours. It's interesting to see how the medical community, government policymakers globally are really turning their attention to saying we need to move fast and we need to get there. And I think that the whole debate around, sort of civil liberties versus the good of the whole is a debate we're yet to have, and one we're going to have.
Yeah, and that's what coming back to things that, we all need to do. Do I like wearing a mask? Not always. It scratches, it's warm, it's hot. But I have friends that work in the healthcare field. I have family. These are people that I don't want getting sick. I don't want the community shutting down again. I don't want to be trapped in my house. And if we all just remember that we're better having a little bit more freedom than what we've had before, because we're working together to keep the numbers in check, and for a period of time we're maybe not doing things that we're used to doing, but we have a greater good in mind. I think it does give us all that chance to continue to enjoy the summer, to enjoy things that we were doing before, while albeit different, protecting everybody against, going backwards, which I don't think anybody really wants.
No.
Certainly not in the business community. I would get a sense that you guys, once you're open, you would like to stay open to do things differently, to do things safely, to build routines and habits that you weren't doing before. But I think it's important for everybody's peace of mind that we're not trapped inside, that we have something to do that gets us back on our routine.
Yeah. Obviously, other jurisdictions are coming at this in different ways. You mentioned immunity before, and of course, there is the notion of herd immunity. And you look at what countries like Sweden are doing, where they're basically saying, let's just let people go out, they will get the disease, and we will get to a level of immunity. And it reminds me of the term culling the herd, which sounds barbaric when we're talking about human beings, but it seems to be a strategy that is being executed in certain jurisdictions. Do you think, with a little bit of hindsight, like matters of weeks, does it seem to be a strategy that makes sense, or is it something that doesn't and we shouldn't be even thinking about it?
Well, I think the strategy makes sense. I think it's just a matter of how do you deploy it in your population, mm-hmm. right? And I think if one thing I've learned is that if you look at all of the news stories from across the world, different populations have different social habits. So I think you would really need to pick the right population with the right degree of social habits to do that in. One example would be South Korea, one example would be Sweden, one example would be the US. You could model it that if you just control interactions to have a very slow burn on the outbreak, that you could do that strategy where you hope you build up herd immunity amongst the mobile elements of your population while protecting the vulnerable groups. But you just have to make sure that it's a right strategy that would fit with how your society runs. Now, I'm not an expert in the Swedish strategy. I've not been able to follow this closely, but even from our own modeling, we know that if we turn off the interventions and they stop working, we will see the cases likely come up. So it's really just having everybody again commit to this strategy and understand that the tenets of how it works well. So again, social distancing, avoiding going out if you're sick, good hygiene with your sneezing and coughing, masking, hand hygiene, all that stuff. Those are all things that you really need a good compliance rate in, or it will not work.
So let me ask you this. It's a very kind of practical question, but if I practice good social distancing, if I make sure I'm washing my hands a lot, if I make sure that I'm wearing a mask when I'm, in contained areas or in buildings where I can't practice good social distancing, if I make sure that, I don't touch my face when I'm in areas where I'm not sure whether surfaces are contaminated, am I going to be okay?
That's a great question, and I would say, in the sense of all of those horizontal strategies, or all those things you do no matter what you're doing when you go out, they're going to provide you a very high level of protection because you've got some redundancy and you've got some, strategies that kind of not make you have to worry about who's contagious, who's going to spread it to you. You're just treating everybody like they're infected, and you're doing very key elements that we know that work. Mm-hmm. So I would say the chances that you get sick from that is minimal to none. Obviously, this is an area where research and people looking at this in modeling studies or in the epidemiological field might see a very, very small signal, but if we think about it as a barometer, you're certainly turning down the temperature extensively. Right. And so if you weren't doing anything, you're going to be relatively worse off from that. I've been doing all of those things. I'm the grocery store guy. I go out. I know what's ahead of me. I know how to navigate my grocery store to get away from everybody for 2 meters. I'm washing my hands frequently. I'm avoiding people that look sick. You know, and there's a comfort knowing that if I'm doing those things well, that I'm okay. And so I don't think that poses a big risk. Where that breaks down is maybe we forget what the new norm is because it's a new habit, and that's
Right.
going to be the tough thing. For me, touching my face, that's the big thing. So I usually try to keep hands in pockets or hands on the shopping cart rail in order to avoid that, you know, but I think these are strategies that work, and if people are employing them with a very high degree of adherence, they're going to work really, really well. And if you do it 99.9% of the time and everybody does it 99.9% of the time, the chance that there is, you know, 1% of 1% interactions clearly make things go in our favor.
Listen, I want to thank you for making time to join us today. It was wonderful to have you on the show. I think that we should probably come back together in a period of time, and with the speed at which things are changing and moving, and also the speed with which we're learning more about this virus, but also what we need to do to protect ourselves. I think it would be good for us to have a chat in a month or so and see what has changed, and look back at this conversation and see exactly how right we were and how wrong we were.
Well, I'd be happy to come back. As I said, this is something that's moving very rapidly, and I think, you know, I think that would be excellent, because I think this is something we're all going to have to do for 2020.
Yep.
Right? And we're going to learn things. We're going to see how the science changes, how as we move through this story together, where we can learn from each other or learn from other groups, and I think it's really important. So I'd be happy to come back and speak to you about
Wonderful.
it again.
Anyway, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you to all of those who are online viewing this conversation, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.